I know you all love your jobs very, very much, but they are very, very passionate about what they have to talk about here. And I'm going to talk with Kim, who's been pretty much devoting herself full time to collecting art for what, almost 15 years, Kim?
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you and your husband Lito have dabbled in some other investments as well, hedge funds, property, stocks and bonds. How has art stocked up against those other investments?
Well, art has been the best investment for us, and my husband totally agrees with that. So it's gone, I mean, we have artworks that have multiplied by over 100 times.
100x, everyone heard that? Okay.
And maybe it's a combination of luck, combination of research and knowledge, and timing, and hard work. But it's proven to be the best investment for us.
And are you still buying today?
Definitely.
Okay.
Yes.
And what advice would you have for people who have perhaps never been to an auction or to Art Basel's coming up next week? Are there any sort of lessons that you've learned how to approach it?
Yes. Well, with regards to auctions, if you are able to get a piece from, say, Christie's, Sotheby's, Phillips, Bonhams, within the estimate, I think that should be pretty good, because the auction houses really give very low estimates. They are not at all market values of the artworks. So if you're able to get them within the estimates, you're doing well. With regards to the art fairs, they're coming up next week. That's what we're here for. Don't be in such a rush to part with your money. So if you see something, and try to be there early. As soon as they open the doors, rush in, because the early bird gets the worm. And if you are able to find something, maybe what you do is just put something on reserve, give them your phone number, and then do some research about that piece or about that artist, and make a decision when you've done at least some research. As my husband loves to say, every puppy looks cute in the pet shop. So you don't right away buy the first puppy you see. Okay, so that's the same with art as well.
Great advice, Kim. Sarah, Sotheby's is also having a big wine auction next 10 days' time as well.
Indeed.
Would you agree with Kim's advice in terms of doing your homework ahead of time, having an idea, and also are wine prices, the estimates, closer to what they're actually likely to fetch?
Well, I think in all cases, the auction houses are looking to sort of lowball the numbers so that they can outstrip their estimates. Sotheby's are very, I think, optimistic about this particular sale. They've said it has the highest estimate of anything they've put out. So far, the record for auction, I believe, is $35 million of the Jaye wines that were his daughters selling off the last of his private collection. But this could well outstrip that. Sotheby's have really taken a lead in focusing on single owner sales that I think has really driven excitement and put them at the head of the market. Even though their additional scruple that they apply to vetting the collections has maybe put them at a disadvantage other times when other sellers have been more eager to look the other way, perhaps, over collections where it's not entirely clear about the provenance.
Or the authenticity at all, as a matter of fact, without naming names.
Without naming names.
Is it fair to say that if Sotheby's says this is a single owner, you know that where the wine's been stored, how it's been transported, that it can attract a premium and you can be pretty much comfortable knowing that that's a good purchase?
I have a pretty high degree of confidence in Sotheby's as an auction house that they will have done the work required. But the point that I think you're getting towards is that the person that you buy from is absolutely critical with wine. There is no such thing as a bargain in the wine world. If the price seems too good to be true, it's quite possibly because even if there's not a question around the authenticity, there's a problem with the provenance, right? Wine is a very fragile product. It needs to be kept not in a cold chain like groceries or dairy, but in very specific conditions. And I mean, we see this all the time after major disasters in the US, for example, hurricanes, fires. There's suddenly a lot of stock entering the Asian market because there's this perception that we're less aware of or less concerned about provenance. And I'm glad to see that gradually changing with time.
And storage is a huge problem, of course, particularly here in Hong Kong. And I think that's something that Darrin can also relate to. Darrin is owner of many fine vintage cars. And Darrin, do you keep most of them in Hong Kong, or?
I used to keep it here in Hong Kong, but as car parking prices and rents has gone up, I decided to ship some of my cars to California, where I get better storage at a much better price. So I think it makes more sense to keep my cars abroad than in Hong Kong.
We may get somebody who trades in car parking spaces for a year from now at the conference. Darrin, and what tips, what mistakes have you made when you first started collecting, and advice you'd have for the audience? And also, most importantly, what's the entry level?
Right, well, mistakes, I made a ton of mistakes, but I think at the end of the day, it's don't buy a lemon. And how to avoid buying a lemon is doing your homework. And that includes getting information about the car and the model you want to buy. Talk to people who have knowledge in the space. Go to car club meetings, and read auction catalogs online. It's freely available, and there's a wealth of information that you can find on a given model. And I'll say generally, buy the best you can afford for a given model. There's no such thing as a cheap Ferrari, but there's rich mechanics. So remember that. No cheap Ferraris.
All right, speaking of Ferraris, the GTO 250, what was it, 62, 63, sold for a record amount last year at auction. What kind of a return did that seller make?
So last year, there was the famous Ferrari 250 GTO. Only 36 of them were made, and it was sold for a record of 48 million at Sotheby's auction. And the seller, his name is Greg Whitten, who is a Microsoft executive, he reportedly bought the car in 2000 for $7 million. So that's a 7x return over 18 years. And if you analyze that, that's around 11%.
Per annum, yeah.
Pretty good.
Not bad at all. In terms of Hong Kong, storage is clearly a problem, parking is a problem. What about things like mechanics? I think when people make purchases, sometimes they forget that the money just keeps, the bills just keep coming in. Is this something that you really have to be mindful of?
Yes, I think especially in a city like Hong Kong, there are only very few mechanics who understand Porsches, Ferraris, and they tend to charge a premium and not necessarily good service. So what happens at the end, it's better for you to learn about your car and be able to fix your car. That's the best way, I think.
Okay. If you had $1 million lying around, where might you suggest that people would look at investing?
I would buy a Ferrari F40, and the reason why I would do that is because it is the last Ferrari that Enzo Ferrari personally kind of endorsed, and he died after it was launched. So it is really the last great Ferrari, I think, and they only made 1,300 of them.
Mm-hmm. So rarity is a big factor in terms of auto collecting.
It is, very much so.
Mm-hmm. And what would you consider as one of the rarest vehicles out there?
Well, the 250 GTO certainly is.
How many did they make?
36. And
okay.
If you ever own a 250 GTO, you really have made it. I think that's the gold standard in car collecting.
Okay. Kim, gold standard, you've been focusing primarily on Japanese art for quite a while and done very well with it. What advice would you have for people who don't know anything about it? What's the first place to start looking? And the other question I have is, should you trust the so-called market experts who are promising fixed returns from buying art from them, or is there such a thing? Should you be mindful of those kind of schemes?
Frederik wrote an article about a certain art fund. And so that turned out to be a real scam. And as in everything else, when you invest in something, you must have some knowledge about the thing. You can't invest in art if you don't know a thing about art. And how do you learn about art? You go to as many museums as you can. You read about art. You read art books. You go to gallery openings. You talk to collectors, talk to curators, to museum people. I mean, get some knowledge before you put in some money. With regards to what would I consider investing in? Is that what you were asking?
I think that's...
At the moment, I would go for like Yayoi Kusama's 1950s works. Those are very limited, very rare, and when they come up in the market, they're worth fighting for.
Okay. For those of you who don't know Yayoi Kusama, she's the woman who makes enormous pumpkins and is obsessed with the spots and dots, and her works are becoming pretty ubiquitous. You can get maybe a litho or something, or a print for what, 50,000
for
US?
Maybe 30,000 US.
Okay. Yeah. And a mega pumpkin, how much might that go for?
Mega pumpkin, maybe $1 million or $1.5 million, $2 million, thereabouts.
And she's still going strong, though, isn't she?
Yes, she's 90 years old, and she turns 90 on March 22. That's her birthday. And she's still painting. So she's still producing works, but she's selling less and less. She wants to keep all her works. Now, as to whether or not we've concentrated strictly on Japanese art, we've not just done Japanese art, we've done some buying of, for example, German artists and some American artists as well.
Sorry to interrupt. Where would you suggest people start? I mean, you have been doing this for years. Should you start with something that feels more familiar, something a little closer to home, rather than just reading somewhere, oh boy, Korean contemporary is really hot, I think I'm going to jump in there? Is it dangerous to try and chase the trends in the art market?
I think you can do both. You can start with whatever's closer to you because I guess it resonates with you. And it's easier also for you to get information if it's within your community or within your country. Easier to find the resources there, easier to sort of gauge their market values. But if you're more adventurous, it's also very interesting to get into the global market and find out about some artists that may not be in the radar of some famous collectors, but might be worth pursuing. And the first thing you do is expose your eye and look for something that you like. I've had some very big missed opportunities simply because maybe I wasn't adventurous enough. And some of these artists are like Kara Walker or Ella Natsui. I mean, the first time I saw their works, I said, this is a compelling artist. And I should have gone right there and then and plunked in some cash, right, on their works. But I didn't. I held back, and now it's a little late.
Okay, so
timing is very important.
But if you know your stuff already, be bold. Sometimes you have to.
Yes, I think there's such a thing as, you know, the blink factor, where if you have the knowledge, you're confident, and you see something that's really good, then you go for it. Recently, we just put in some money on an American Chinese artist. You'll see him in Art Basel, Hong Kong, and he's also going to have a solo in one of the galleries in Hong Kong. And I think he's in a group exhibition as well of K11. But yeah, we visited the artist, and it's very interesting.
Okay.
So things like that. I mean,
there's lots of opportunities out there still.
Rely on serendipity.
Okay, great. Sarah, timing, a lot of people here can probably follow the LiveX wine index on their Bloomberg terminals. Where does the market look like it's headed? And tell us things we should think about. I think you mentioned climate change could actually be a pretty big factor going forward and something we should be mindful of.
Yeah, I mean, something that is a little bit frightening for people who collect fine wine is how heavily it is weighted towards regions in Europe. Why do I say that? Because European wine laws are much more rigid in the way that they're structured, right? So there are designated regions, there are grape varieties, there are requirements for the way that the wine is made in those regions that are much less likely to be changed to adapt to some of the factors like frost, like increased disease pressure. Whereas the New World has a lot more tools at its disposal because there aren't these same restrictive laws. Bordeaux, even though it's fallen in terms of its share of tradable wine, it's still about 60% of the market. Burgundy definitely up there as well. And there is a real question around the longevity of some of these wines, right? The climatic conditions that we're dealing with now bear very little resemblance to some of the great wines of history. So it's really hard to tell, particularly with wines that I personally love, so would hate to malign, but white Burgundy, those of you who are wine collectors will be very aware of the issue of premox, premature oxidation, these wines not showing the longevity that perhaps they should. And there is a real question around whether that's to do with changing climate conditions. Unfortunately, very much unlike the art world, there really aren't these overnight success stories on anywhere near the scale. There are a couple I can name that have really soared in price. So Keller's G-Max has really become a tradable wine that almost came out of nowhere, but for the most part, the wines that are traded on a regular basis is a very consistent list for decades.
What about, there's a couple of wine funds out there. Would you recommend that to anybody in the room?
No, sorry.
That was easy.
No way to dress it up. I mean, I think, to be honest, I think the industry has reacted to the fact that following 2011, a lot of them had to wind up. It was just, there are inherent conflicts. A lot of the time, the wines that actually perform really well are not necessarily the wines that people who invest in these funds because they love wine really care about, right? Sometimes it's really unsexy vintages, 2007, 2011, that have performed really well, say, over the past 5 years. If you look at, I think, the top 10 performing wines that were 150% returns over that time, they were all unusual vintages or lesser cuvées. The top 50 have not performed as well over the past 5 years.
Darrin, could you tell us a couple of other models that are probably in the sweet spot? They're not 36 million like the Ferrari, they're not 100,000, but in that middle category, are they more likely to hold their value if there's a major downturn in global markets or there's any kind of unforeseen crisis when people suddenly decide to pull in their horns?
Well, I think if you look at the classic car spectrum, what differentiates between a used car and as a classic car, it's really about the passion. And whether it's your $30,000 Mercedes from your grandpa or a Ferrari, it's different to everybody. And it doesn't mean that a cheaper model doesn't appreciate. It's really the whole idea about what you like and what kind of clicks, what's your passion, why are you driving the car you're driving. And I think, generally speaking, there's a few kind of levels that one would look at, and one's around 100,000 US dollars. And for that amount of money, you can buy a pretty decent Ferrari or Porsche 911 that speaks to a lot of people, especially those who grew up in the 80s and 90s. So those are the cars that really spark the whole passion for this group of buyers who are becoming more and more kind of out there buying the cars of their youth. And this is a big kind of market shift from, say, 20 years ago when the majority of buyers are still buying older cars from the 50s and 60s. Nowadays, the market is changing. The collectors are changing because of demographics. So people in the 40s, they are buying cars made from the 90s onwards, because that's the car that they can relate to.
So there's a nostalgia factor, revisiting one's youth.
Yes.
And I think you told me that there's a model that featured in one of the Fast and Furious films, a Japanese car that's not particularly sexy, but is in quite a bit of demand right now?
It's called the Total Supra. So for those of you who grew up in the 90s or maybe watched the Fast and Furious franchise, it's a car that, frankly, is not that special. And there are many of them around. I think they made probably, I'll say, maybe 50,000 around, and they're all the same, so they're not like special editions. And the world record was broken when, I think it was 2015, when that particular car, driven by Paul Walker in the film, was auctioned and sold for around $180,000. So it's not a huge amount, but it's already trading, double the price of a normal Supra.
And what about limited edition cars that are being turned out today? Should people try to buy those direct from the manufacturer, or is it better to wait and see what's going to happen?
That's a good question. Manufacturers, especially Porsche, they like nowadays they like to roll out these limited edition models like every year. So it doesn't become that limited if you have a special edition every year. And I think for buyers looking to invest in these cars, I probably wouldn't say they're a great investment, but obviously they do have their special color and special rims. So if you like those kind of things, it's okay. But I'm not going to pay a premium for that.
Sarah, there's been a lot of excitement around whiskey as well, and I know you're a master of wine, but what distinguishes wine investment from whiskey investment, do you think? Are they chalk and cheese, or are they sort of part of the same asset class?
I think they can be seen as part of the same asset class. I mean, the prices for the top whiskies have definitely outstripped those of wine. And there is definitely a factor that you have, I would say, more reliability in terms of the longevity of a whiskey. It's much less likely that you're going to open your ancient bottle of whiskey and find that it's become vinegar. Forgive me for maligning my own industry. But so I mean, top whiskey prices are sort of a million and up, whereas the record for wine is, I think, 586,000 for DRC 1945 bottle. I think that another factor would be that whiskey, that you can drink over a certain period of time. You have a bit more of a window, whereas with wine, there's the, you have your one shot, you open it, and that's kind of the only opportunity you have to enjoy it.
The 45, is that clearly it's ready for drinking? How many more years? Because wines do, they peak at a certain point, and
Indeed.
Their half-life, how long is that? So the 45, if you did buy it, you pretty much have to intend to drink it within a certain time period?
I wish it were that scientific. Frankly, the 45 is going to be one of these collector's items that will pass from hand to hand long after its drinking window has passed. I think it'll end up being like the Jefferson bottles, if they had been real. Where people will continue to see them really as collectibles, almost like a piece of art, rather than a real wine for drinking or even an investment product per se. These extraordinarily rare wines have done extraordinarily well in terms of value, so that they've sort of seen 900% increase in price. The wines that Rudy Cornillo won, for example, faked, those types of wines would have seen about 900% appreciation over the past 10 years, much less for normal tradable wines.
Right. For those of you who don't know who Rudy Cornillo is, he was convicted basically for producing counterfeit wines, rare bottles.
Out of New York, indeed.
Yeah, anyway, one of them was purportedly belonged to Thomas Jefferson, when in fact it did not. He would print his own labels. He would distress them so that they looked old and so on. So there are, for some very expensive wines, there's definitely a lot of fraudsters out there.
Absolutely.
Conservative estimate, what percentage of wines trading hands might have not been from the actual producers?
Issues. Well, numbers that are being circulated regularly by people who I trust, who are authentication experts, are 20% of the fine wine traded, which is terrifying. It's a terrifying figure, particularly given the amount that was quoted was 15 billion for the whole of the market. So that's saying about $3 billion worth of fake wine in circulation. Estimates for how much Rudy produced are about 550 million. And very little of that has been destroyed. The dirty secret is that often when there's a question about wine, it may be turned away, but it won't be destroyed because that would be too costly for all the players involved. And often people actually can't afford to destroy them. So they just go back out there into the market.
So buyer beware.
Indeed.
Indeed. Unfortunately, we've already run out of time, but I think takeaway lessons are do your homework. Due diligence matters just as much for these exotic investments as it does in anything else that you do in your day job. So thank you very much for your insights and advice, all three of you.